So, welcome everyone who is here today to the second part of the lecture on post. Yeah, can you all hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Okay. So, lost time can never be found. Okay. So, just what we have already covered in part one comprises the incidence, definition, risk factors, etiology, the medical management mainly of postpartum hemorrhage, and the management of PPH in general. Okay. In this part, what we are going to cover is mechanical management in detail, surgical management of postpartum hemorrhage, traumatic postpartum hemorrhage, secondary PPH, as well as prophylaxis of postpartum hemorrhage. Okay, so just a brief recapitulation of what we have already seen in the last lecture for those of you who are attending our lecture for the first time. The four important T's, which are the etiological causes of postpartum hemorrhage. So to begin with, atonic PPH, so tone of the uterus, trauma, which includes genital tract trauma, uterine inversion, placenta, which is retained, so tissue, and blood coagulopathies, so that is thrombin. Okay, so we have seen in atonic PPH, first line management is use of oxytocin. Okay, routinely as a part of active management, oxytocin intramuscular 10 units within 1 minute of delivery of the baby should be given. If that maneuver fails, then the second line treatment is methylergometrin. If atonicity is not controlled or hemorrhage is not controlled with these two, then you can proceed on to carboprost or misoprostol. But in case uterus is not responding to any of these uterotonics and the bleeding continues, blood loss is more than 1000 ml with severe hemorrhage, then you must proceed to transfusion of blood and blood products, platelet transfusions, support the blood pressure with vasopressors, and move on to the mechanical and surgical management of postpartum hemorrhage. So do not waste any time. Time is very precious when it comes to management of postpartum hemorrhage. So let's begin today's lecture with mechanical management. Okay. Can you all please switch off your annotations? I think there are annotations coming on my screen. If you all can stop using annotations, please. Yeah. So bimanual compression is the first, which we are going to see, followed by uterine balloon tamponade. Uterine packing in itself has fallen out of favor because of the advent of balloon tamponade, which works better. Also, there are a number of disadvantages of uterine packing, which includes concealment of ongoing hemorrhage. It does not allow you to measure or account for ongoing bleeding. Okay. Second drawback is risk of infection as well as formation of adhesions in the cavity. So, uterine packing has fallen out of favor. Bimanual compression, which we are going to see here. So, as you can see, bimanual compression is done using both your hands. The uterus is positioned with the fist of one hand in the anterior fornix, pushing against the anterior uterine wall, which is held in place by the other hand on the abdomen. Abdominal hand is also used for uterine massage. So basically what we have done here, compress the anterior and posterior uterine walls against each other in order to control the hemorrhage. Okay. This can serve as a measure or as an intervention in itself, which will control the hemorrhage, or it can be a temporizing measure whilst you're transferring the patient to a tertiary care center or maybe to the operation theater for definitive surgical management or even for interventional radiological management. Okay, so this can also serve as a temporizing measure. It will buy you some more time before massive amount of hemorrhage takes place. Okay, next, coming to uterine balloon tamponade. So various balloon catheters have been used for uterine tamponade. What is the mechanism of action of a balloon tamponade? They compress the uterine cavity from within at a pressure which is greater than the systemic arterial pressure and hence arrests the bleeding. Okay, so there are a number of balloon tamponades which are available. The first three, that is Foley's, the Buckley balloon, as well as Sengstach and Blackmore tube, these have the advantage of having a drainage tip. Okay, now this drainage tip works to help in draining out the ongoing hemorrhage which is taking place inside the uterine cavity after dilatation of the balloon. Foley's catheter, one of the disadvantages is the capacity of the balloon. Even if you take a 30 to 34 French Foley's catheter, the capacity of the balloon is not more than 80 to 90 ml. Okay, sometimes this is not enough for using as a tamponade in a large uterine cavity. Okay, so this might not be very helpful. The Bakri balloon is a very good catheter, especially made for postpartum hemorrhage. However, one of the disadvantage is its cost. Okay, so this is almost $250. That is 13,000 rupees, Indian rupees, and even locally made ones are not anything lesser than 5,000 rupees. So cost is a restricting factor. Sengstach and Blackmore balloon catheters, these are actually used for esophageal varices. Okay, when used in postpartum hemorrhage, the gastric balloon goes inside the uterine cavity, whereas the esophageal balloon stays in the vagina. Okay, so then this provides tamponade to the uterus, and the esophageal balloon provides tamponade or serves as a packing of the vagina. Okay, Rush's balloon, again, this has a capacity of around 300 to 500 ml, just like the Bakri balloon. But the disadvantage in a Rush's balloon is that the drainage tip is not present. So any ongoing hemorrhage cannot be accounted for. Next, coming to the condom catheter. Now, this is a very innovative catheter which can be used in low resource settings, especially in the rural areas. And it is very simple to make. It is nothing but a Foley's catheter on which a condom has been rolled out and tied at the base with a silk thread or any other ligature material. Okay, just remember that the distance from the tip of the condom till the point where you tie it, this distance should be equal to the distance of the uterine cavity, or in short, the tied ligature should be at the level of the internal os. Okay, so you have to measure it and tie it accordingly. Okay. Secondly, do not tie it very tightly, otherwise you're going to obliterate the catheter. Okay. At the same time, it should be a firm tie, otherwise all the fluid which you instill inside the condom is just going to leak out, and your tamponade is not going to work. Okay. So coming to the two types of catheters which we have seen, one with the drainage tip. So this is what a Bakri balloon looks like in utero. So you can see there is a drainage tip which actually helps in measuring the amount of ongoing blood loss. Whereas in a Foley's condom catheter, that drainage tip is not present because the condom completely covers the catheter, and therefore you cannot measure the ongoing blood loss. But this is still helpful in a low resource setting where too many facilities are not available. Okay, because it is very cheap to make also. Yeah, so this is the condom catheter. I'll briefly explain to you the working. Okay, so here you can see there is just a Foley's catheter, maybe a 16 or 18 French Foley's catheter can be used. A condom is rolled out onto it and tied at the base. Okay, inflation is done from the urinary drainage port. Okay, so once you have tied the condom over the Foley's catheter, before inflating it, using your 2 fingers or a sponge holding forceps, the entire assembly is placed inside the uterine cavity up to the level of the fundus. Okay, once that is done, inflate the condom either with normal saline or distilled water till no further bleeding is occurring. Usually around 300 to 500 ml is required. Now this inflation can be done using 2 techniques. Either you can directly attach an IV cannula or an IV set to the urinary drainage port of the Foley's catheter, which in turn is attached to the normal saline bottle, and you can use this for inflating the condom catheter. Or you can simply use a syringe, a 20 or 50 cc syringe can be used, and the condom catheter can be inflated. Okay. After inflation, remember, especially if you have inflated with a syringe, remember to apply a clamp in order to keep the normal saline within the condom after inflation. So this clamp should be applied at this V junction. Otherwise, the entire instilled fluid is going to just leak backwards. Okay, so here is where you apply the clamp. You can alternatively, you can also tie a ligature, which should be tight enough to prevent backflow of all the fluid which you have instilled. Shivkar's pack is also a type of condom catheter, but in this the condom is directly tied over the IV set. okay, which is in turn attached to a normal saline bottle and it is inflated. Okay, it is similar in working except Shivka's pack does not use a Foley's catheter. Okay, CG balloon. Okay, now this also is a very innovative modification of the original Foley's condom catheter. It was the brainchild of a doctor from Chhattisgarh, which is why it is called as the Chhattisgarh balloon. Okay, it is an innovative condom balloon tamponade in postpartum hemorrhage, especially to be used in the low resource settings. And this paper was published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology of India in 2016. Okay, must go through this paper if you all have the time. So what exactly is a Chhattisgarh balloon and how is it different from a Foley's condom catheter? The most important difference, Chhattisgarh balloon has a drainage tip. So you can account or you can measure the amount of ongoing hemorrhage in the uterine cavity. How is this made? Again, you can use a 16 or 18 French Foley's catheter. Okay. 2 rings are cut out from the urinary drainage pot of the same Foley's catheter. So you cut out 2 rings and these are the rings which are going to be used to tie the condom over the catheter. Okay, so cutting out the rings is the first step. Second, inflate the balloon of the Foley's using 5 cc of air and excise the entire balloon from the catheter. Okay, so basically you're just not only incising or bursting the balloon, but complete excision of the balloon should be done. Okay, next step, roll out a condom from the tip of the catheter and tie it with one of these rings which you have cut out at the base. Okay, again, the distance should be equal to the uterine cavity or the fundus to the internal os. Second tie is placed more distally. This time the condom should be tied between the eye of the Foley's catheter and the excised balloon. In between this, you put the distal tie. Okay, 2 throws of this ring and the catheter and the condom will be tied over the catheter. Next step, cut out the tip of the Foley's catheter along with the overlying condom. Okay, so that you make for a drainage tip. Okay, next you have completed the formation of this catheter. So you have the condom which is tied over the tip of the catheter. When this is done, you first, before inflating it, insert it into the uterine cavity and then hold it in place and then you inflate the condom. Okay, how is it inflated? From which pot? It is the balloon inflation pot which you are going to use to inflate this condom. So in short, what you have done is you have excised the original balloon of the Foley's catheter, which is of a smaller capacity, and you have replaced it with a larger capacity condom. Okay, so this is how a Chhattisgarh balloon is made. The advantage, one, as I said, it has a drainage tip, which the normal Foley's condom catheter does not. Secondly, the ongoing hemorrhage can be measured by attaching a urosac to the urinary drainage pot. So whatever hemorrhage is taking place will be collected in the urosac. Second advantage, you do not need to tie it using a suture material. Okay, so you do not need to even use silk or any other ligature to tie the condom to the catheter. So you're saving on the cost there. This entire assembly costs only around 100 rupees. Okay, if you compare it with the Bakri balloon, this is a win-win situation in a low resource setting. Okay. Secondly, the tie is secure enough that it prevents backflow of the instilled fluid. Okay, and also maintains the patency of the catheter. Okay, so this is one of the modifications of the normal Foley's condom catheter. Okay, so you must know how to make this. So coming to practical aspects of uterine tamponade, insertion. Now digital insertion using sponge holding forceps or using your fingers should be done. USG, if available, can be used for guiding insertion and confirming placement. Vaginal packing at times is required to maintain the placement of the catheter, especially if the cervix is dilated. Now, sometimes what happens after a vaginal delivery, the cervix is generally effaced and dilated. So even after you place the whatever balloon catheter or tamponade inside the uterine cavity, there are chances that it may fall off. Okay, so to prevent this, vaginal packing should be done. But remember, before packing the vagina confirm a positive tamponade test. Now, what is the tamponade test? Tamponade test is when you inflate the balloon catheter or any drainage balloon catheter inside the uterine cavity. As soon as the inflation is completed to its maximum capacity, if there is cessation of bleeding or hemorrhage from the uterine cavity, it suggests that the intra-balloon pressure is more than the systemic arterial pressure and your tamponade is actually working. It is stopping or preventing the hemorrhage. So this is a positive tamponade test. You have to confirm that the bleeding has stopped and your method has worked before packing the vagina. Otherwise, what is going to happen? You're going to conceal the ongoing hemorrhage which is taking place in the intrauterine cavity. Okay, you will not be able to assess how much bleeding is taking place if you pack up the vagina. Okay. Next point, distension should be sufficient enough for hemostasis. Excess can lead to uterine pain and rupture. Okay, so just enough distension should be achieved so that there is a positive tamponade test. That is, the hemorrhage stops. Balloon tamponade can be kept in situ for 12 to 24 hours. There have been studies in which it has been kept in situ for 24 to 48 hours, but of course, under antimicrobial prophylaxis. So broad spectrum antibiotics should be used. Deflation should be done very slowly. Most of the studies use the rate of deflation to be 20 ml per hour, and you must watch out for bleeding at the same time. Bleeding should be controlled on inflation of the balloon. In case of a negative tamponade test, that is, if the balloon is inflated and the bleeding has not stopped, hemorrhage continues, the next steps in management of postpartum hemorrhage should be undertaken, and usually these are surgical steps. Next, coming to aortic compression. Okay, now aortic compression is a temporizing measure. It is not a definitive management. Remember that. It is a measure which is used only to control temporarily hemorrhage or bleeding from the uterus during transfer of the patient either to the operation theatre or to a tertiary care center. So remember, it is to be used not as a definitive measure but as a temporizing measure. How is this done? External aortic compression is done using both your hands. First and foremost, you have to palpate for the femoral arterial pulse. Okay. Once you are sure that the femoral arterial pulse is present, well palpated, then with the other hand, you make a fist with your finger out, with your thumb out. Okay, so the fist should be made in such a way that the thumb lies outside the fist. Following this, pressure is applied at the level of the umbilicus, slightly to the left of the midline. Okay, so if you recall your anatomy, aorta lies slightly to the left of the midline, slightly to the left of the inferior vena cava. So pressure should be applied in the midline, but at the level of the umbilicus, slightly to the left of the patient. Okay, and continuous pressure is applied, slowly increasing in strength, and it should be at a right angle, that is perpendicular to the body of the patient. Once you start feeling the aortic compression, once you start feeling the aortic pulsations, you have reached the aorta. Slightly more pressure after that will obliterate these pulsations, and you will start feeling the bony surface of the vertebral column below. At this point, to confirm that your aorta is well compressed, recheck for the femoral arterial pulse. If the femoral arterial pulse has been obliterated, which means your aortic compression is adequate. Okay, if it has not been obliterated, that means that the compression is either in the wrong place or insufficient, or you're not doing it properly. Okay, so remember, femoral arterial pulsations will tell you whether this method is working or not. So what does the WHO have to say about external aortic compressions? So WHO recommendation as of September 2012 on the use of external aortic compression for the treatment of postpartum hemorrhage due to atony after vaginal birth. They have recommended it as a temporizing measure until appropriate care is available. Okay, so though there is weak recommendation and very low quality evidence, there have been a few studies, especially from very low resource settings, the rural settings, where aortic compression before transfer of the patient or during transfer of the patient to a tertiary care center has actually helped in saving or preventing maternal mortalities. Okay. Next, coming to non-pneumatic anti-shock garments. Okay, now this is another temporizing measure. It's a simple neoprene and Velcro first aid device used as a temporizing measure to treat shock, resuscitate the patient, stabilize the patient, prevent further bleeding in women with postpartum hemorrhage till definitive treatment or transfer is undertaken. Okay, now this anti-shock garments comes in 5 pieces and it has to be applied as shown in this picture. So the first one is applied first, second is applied second, and so on and so forth. And how does this help? So what happens in postpartum hemorrhage is that there is excessive opening of the sinuses, excessive dilatation and congestion in the pelvis as well as in the lower limb. So there is accumulation and pooling of blood in the lower compartments of the body. What this anti-shock garment does, it increases the pressure in the lower parts of the body as well as the pelvis and squeezes out the blood from this part, increasing venous return, and therefore in turn increases the blood supply to the vital organs, that is the brain, the heart, the lungs, etc. And it delays the onset of shock. Okay, so there is a rapid recovery of all the vital parameters in patients in whom anti-shock garments have been put on. Okay, so what is the WHO recommendation on this? Use of non-pneumatic anti-shock garment is recommended as a temporizing measure until appropriate care is available. So remember, these are just temporizing measures, not definitive management. You cannot omit definitive management just because you have used either aortic compression or anti-shock garments. Okay. Next, coming to the surgical management. When all these procedures have failed, mechanical management is not working, do not waste too much time. Move on to surgical management of the patient. Shift the patient to the operation theatre as soon as possible, because once the patient goes into a state of irreversible shock or disseminated intravascular coagulation, surgical procedures are going to cause more complications. So you have to know which time is right to take the patient for a surgical management. Okay. Surgical management includes compression sutures, stepwise devascularization of the uterus, angiographic embolization, and pelvic packing. So first, let's take a look at compression sutures, that is B-Lynch suture. Okay, so B-Lynch sutures were first used by Dr. Christopher B. Lynch way back in 1989, and it was first used on a patient with atonic postpartum hemorrhage who refused to give consent for hysterectomy. Okay, so basically he was forced to use these sutures, and finally there was control of postpartum hemorrhage and the life of the patient was actually saved. Okay, so after that a number of patients have been studied with B-Lynch sutures, and his paper was published in 1997, okay, regarding the usefulness of these sutures. So how do these sutures work? It aims to control bleeding by exerting continuous vertical compression on the vascular system. Okay, so these are longitudinal sutures or brace sutures which exert a vertical compression on the vascular compartments. Before applying these sutures, you must test for potential efficacy. Okay, so before you decide to apply B-Lynch sutures, you must compress the uterus bimanually. So one hand is placed posteriorly, one hand is placed anteriorly, and bimanually compress the uterus and check if there is still ongoing hemorrhage or is hemorrhage controlled. If this compression controls the hemorrhage, most likely B-Lynch sutures are going to help in this patient. If the hemorrhage continues, then most likely B-Lynch sutures may not help in that patient. Okay. One more important point to keep in mind while applying these sutures: keep the uterus compressed throughout application of sutures. So ask your assistant to compress the uterus as you are applying these sutures so as to maintain tension on the suture material. We don't want the sutures to be lax. This is what your uterus should look like at the end of the procedure. Okay, it is a tight compression suture. Uterine cavity is not obliterated in these sutures. I will explain to you how these sutures are taken, and then you will understand how the uterine cavity is not obliterated. And a number of studies have shown that there was no problem in future pregnancies in women in whom B-Lynch sutures have been used in the previous pregnancy. Okay, so how are B-Lynch sutures taken? First, most important prerequisite is presence of a hysterotomy incision. Okay, if you're performing this after a cesarean section, you already have a uterine incision. If it is done after a vaginal delivery, you will have to make a hysterotomy incision. Okay, suture material to be used can be chromic catgut, which Beelange had used in his first operation. But now it is shown that even polyglactin, that is your Vicryl sutures, can be used without any serious complications. So the first bite is taken 3 centimeters below. First bite is taken 3 centimeters below the lower margin of the uterine incision and 4 centimeters away from the lateral margin of the uterus. This bite comes out 3 centimeters above the upper margin of the uterine incision and again 4 centimeters away from the lateral margin of the uterus. Okay. Then the suture is passed above the fundus, brought posteriorly. This dotted line represents the posterior part of the sutures. Posteriorly, it comes out and the next bite is taken from the posterior wall of the uterus into the uterine cavity. Uterine cavity is entered and immediately exited adjacent to the suture which you have first taken, and posteriorly exiting of the suture line, and then it comes again anteriorly over the fundus. Okay, so you have just entered the uterine cavity on the posterior aspect and immediately you get the suture again anteriorly. Once the suture comes anteriorly, the next bite is taken 3 centimeters again above the upper margin of the uterine incision, and this bite exits finally 3 centimeters below the lower margin. Once this has been done, tighten the sutures. Okay, your assistant has already compressed the uterus throughout. Tighten these sutures and place the knot anteriorly as such. Okay, so this is what the uterus should look like, and after that your uterine hysterotomy incision can be sutured. Okay, so as you can see, the uterine cavity here is not obliterated. There have been many modifications of compression sutures. The next we are going to see is Hayman sutures. Okay, now one advantage of Hayman sutures is that the lower uterine segment or uterine cavity is not opened, and therefore you can place these sutures very easily. They're faster and easier to place. But the disadvantage of this same thing is that uterine cavity cannot be explored under direct vision. In Beelange sutures, since you're taking a hysterotomy incision, you have the opportunity of looking into the uterine cavity, making sure there are no leftover bits of placenta or any blood clots or any membrane bits which you can take out if present. Hayman sutures, this opportunity is not provided because you do not take a hysterotomy incision at all, but it is probably quicker to apply. Okay, so in these sutures, the suture enters anteriorly, it traverses the uterine cavity, exits posteriorly, and then both these loose ends are tied with tension on the fundal surface. Okay, so 1, 2, or 3 longitudinal sutures are what comprises the Hayman sutures. But the disadvantage here is, since you are individually tying these longitudinal sutures, there could be chances of unequal tension on the 2 ligatures. Okay, because of this, unequal tension can lead to segmental ischemia secondary to slippage of a loose suture, and it can cause shouldering with venous obstruction. Okay, so that is one of the disadvantages. However, Hayman sutures can also be used for lower uterine segment bleeding, especially in cases of placenta previa, where the lower uterine segment is bleeding. Similar sutures are taken, but these are transverse now in the lower uterine segment. Okay, so these are the horizontal cervicoisthmic sutures, which form a part of the Hayman sutures, which can be taken to prevent postpartum hemorrhage due to bleeding from the lower uterine segment. Next, coming to Cho's sutures. Now, Cho's sutures are multiple full thickness square sutures which are applied to multiple parts of the uterine body. It may be probably time consuming if many square sutures are required. One of the disadvantages of this is that since it traverses the uterine cavity, the entire part of the uterine cavity which is present in between these sutures is completely obliterated. Okay, so the anterior and posterior walls of the uterus are completely compressed against each other in between these squares. So there are higher chances of ischemia, necrosis, uterine defects in particularly these squared sutures. Okay, so uterine cavity drainage is restricted, and pyometra and Seineke risk is increased in CHO sutures. But the advantage is it is useful in lower segment bleeding. So you can place these individual square sutures even in the lower uterine segment in cases of placenta previa, for example, if there is excessive bleeding from the lower segment. Next, coming to Pereira sutures. Now these combine longitudinal as well as transverse sutures, which are placed as a series of bites. So you can see these are series of bites into the myometrium. And remember, the suture material never enters the uterine cavity. So it is a partial thickness bite of the myometrium. So longitudinal sutures begin and end at the level of the transverse suture, which is closest to the cervix. So there are various such compression sutures, though we cannot discuss all here, but a number of such modifications of compression sutures have come up, and a number of studies are still taking place as to deciding which suture provides the most advantage. Okay, so there is no one suture which is better than the other. Each has their own advantages, each has its own disadvantages. Okay. Next step, coming to stepwise devascularization of the uterus. Okay, now this is another uterus conserving method in which you devascularize the uterus in a stepwise manner. So what are these steps? It should be done in this order itself. So first, unilateral uterine vessel ligation. Okay, so look at this picture over here. This is the internal iliac artery. This is the uterine artery which branches out from the internal iliac artery. Okay, it goes towards the uterus over the ureters. It gives out an ascending branch. It gives out a descending branch which supplies the uterus. So your first step is ligating the ascending branch, okay, closer to the uterine incision. Okay, so this is the first step. Unilaterally, you ligate this vessel. If unilateral ligation is not working, you will perform a bilateral ligation of the uterine vessel. Still, if the bleeding is not stopping, the hemorrhage continues. Third step is low uterine vessel ligation. So this comprises ligating the descending branch of the uterine artery around 3 to 4 centimeters from the first ligature. For low uterine vessel ligation, you will have to dissect the bladder flap and retract the bladder downwards in order to expose this segment. Okay. After this, even then, if the bleeding is not stopped, you will proceed to unilateral ligation of the utero-ovarian anastomosis, which is present just below the suspensory ligament of the ovary. Okay, so this is the place where you ligate it. First unilateral and then bilateral. Okay, despite all this stepwise devascularization, if bleeding does not stop, you may proceed to internal iliac artery ligation. Okay, but this is what comprises the stepwise devascularization of the uterus. From amongst all these, uterine vessel ligation, I will be discussing the technique. So for uterine artery ligation, expose the lower part of the broad ligament, exteriorize the uterus, and identify properly the uterine artery. Okay, feel for uterine artery pulsations near the junction of the uterus and the cervix. So this is the uterine artery over here. Hold the broad ligament in your hand. Make sure that when you're taking a bite around the uterine artery, no part of the bowel comes into the bite. Okay, so the bowel may be lying very close at this point behind the broad ligament. So place a finger for protection. Okay, if the bowel is not, you're not able to retract it manually, then you can just pack the bowel behind. Okay, pass a needle around the artery and through 2 to 3 centimeters of the myometrium. So part of the myometrium around 2 to 3 centimeters has to come in the suture. Okay, remember that. Tie the suture securely. Okay, there is no point if you're not going to tie it tight enough. Place sutures as close to the uterus as possible, as the ureter is only 1 centimeter lateral to the uterine artery, especially when you're tying the uterine artery at a lower level. After retraction of the bladder, the ureters lie very close to the uterine artery. So you have to be very mindful of the position of the ureters, okay, to prevent injury. So when surgical devascularization fails, what is your next step? Internal iliac artery ligation. But all these steps should be undertaken depending upon the rate of bleeding, the rate of transfusion of blood and blood products, and the patient's vital parameters and the patient's condition. Okay. If you feel that at any step the patient's condition is deteriorating, you might as well jump to a cesarean hysterectomy straight away instead of wasting time in all these procedures. Okay. Internal iliac artery ligation. So just a brief review of the anatomy. The common iliac artery bifurcates into the external iliac artery and internal iliac artery. So this is the right side of the patient. This is the right common iliac artery. External iliac artery and internal iliac artery. It bifurcates at the level of the pelvic brim. Another important anatomical feature over here is that the ureter passes from the lateral side of the common iliac artery, crosses the bifurcation at the pelvic brim, and comes to lie on the medial aspect of the internal iliac artery. So the ureter is present medial to the internal iliac artery. So what is the rationale behind internal iliac artery ligation? Experiments by Burchell in the 1960s, ascertained that ligating the internal iliac artery turned the pelvic system into a venous system. Okay, so basically it reduced the pulse pressure in the pelvic arterial vasculature, hence aiding clotting and control of postpartum hemorrhage. Bilateral ligation results in 85% reduction in pulse pressure and 49% reduction in pelvic blood flow, resulting in venous pressures in the arterial circuit. So that is the rationale behind ligation of internal iliac artery. So let's take a look at a few surgical aspects. Remember, the internal iliac artery also helps, ligation also helps in vaginal bleeding, because the vaginal artery is also a branch of the anterior division of the internal iliac artery. So we have the common iliac artery, which divides into the internal iliac artery, external iliac artery. This is again the right side of the patient. Internal iliac artery gives out a posterior branch and continues as an anterior branch. Okay. So while ligating the internal iliac artery, we have to spare this posterior branch of the internal iliac artery. So what you are ligating in internal iliac artery ligation is the anterior branch of the internal iliac artery, because the posterior branch gives out a number of important divisions like the iliolumbar artery, the lateral sacral artery, and the superior gluteal artery. So we do not want to ligate this vessel. So nowhere above this part are you going to ligate the internal iliac artery. It has to be ligated below or after the posterior division has been given out. So to be on the safer side, around 3 to 4 centimeters from the bifurcation of the common iliac artery, the internal iliac artery should be ligated. Okay. It can be reported cases. The reported success rate varies widely from 42% to 93%. It can be done therapeutically, for example, as we have seen now in cases of atoning postpartum hemorrhage, or it can be done prophylactically, like we have seen in cases of placenta accreta syndromes. Okay, or in cases where you are anticipating a cesarean hysterectomy. Before starting the hysterectomy, you can ligate the internal iliac artery before moving on to the hysterectomy, so that there is reduction in the blood loss during your surgical procedure. In order to preserve the posterior division, the anterior division should be ligated close to the uterine artery, that is 3 to 4 centimeters from the bifurcation. Okay. Now the technique of reaching this internal iliac artery, mostly the intraperitoneal procedure is followed. The peritoneum can be incised in between the round ligament and the infundibulopelvic ligament in order to reach these vessels, or directly at the pelvic brim, you can incise the peritoneum and reach the bifurcation of the common iliac artery. Once this is done, the next step is bearing of the anterior division of the internal iliac artery. Okay, so for bearing, there is a lot of areolar tissue which is present around. Okay, so blunt dissection will also help in this bearing of the internal iliac artery. It can be done with your fingers. It can be done with a hemostatic forceps. Okay, once this artery has been bared, next step is hooking it with a mixture. Now, before hooking it with the mixture, remember that you must be mindful of the important structures lying around the internal iliac artery. One being the ureter. So as I said, ureter lies medial to the internal iliac artery. It is present in the medial flap of the peritoneum and it has to be retracted away from your surgical field. So in this picture, the ureter has been retracted medially, which is why you can't see it in the field. And this is a very good dissection before ligating the internal iliac artery. Second structure is the internal iliac vein. Now the internal iliac vein lies directly below the internal iliac artery, and it is generally, both of them are adhered to each other by loose areolar tissue. Okay, so before piercing or before poking your mixture below the internal iliac artery, make sure that you have dissected the internal iliac vein away from the artery. Whenever you are inserting the mixture, in order to hook the internal iliac artery, it has to be done from a lateral side of the patient to the medial side. Okay, because a mixture is a bent instrument, you do not have control over the tip, and if you insert it from the medial to the lateral side, you're going to end up injuring the external iliac vein over here. Okay, so it has to be inserted from the lateral to the medial side. Next, the suture material has to be fed into the mixture. So the suture material can be non-absorbable silk, it can be Vicryl number 0, or even vascular clips can be used. And 2 ligatures have to be placed 0.5 centimeters apart. Okay, it has to be a firm tie. You need not transect the vessel between the two, because it will just increase the amount of oozing or blood loss, or it can even cause injury to the surrounding structures. So there is no need to transect the vessels. Just tying them at 2 points with 0.5 centimeters in between is enough. Okay, a few more nuances regarding internal iliac artery ligation. Pulsations of the femoral artery and dorsalis pedis must be identified after tying the ligatures to make sure that the external iliac artery is not ligated accidentally. This is very important, because sometimes if you have inadvertently ligated the external iliac artery, it is going to lead to gangrene of the lower limbs, and which might even require amputation, because the external iliac artery continues to form the femoral artery beyond the inguinal ligament. So you have to be very careful that it is not the external iliac artery you have ligated. So feel for the pulsations of the femoral artery and dorsalis pedis. As a habit, it should, even if you're 100% sure that you have ligated the internal iliac artery, just as a routine habit, feel for the pulsations of the femoral artery. There is ample collateral circulation and anastomotic network which supplies blood to the organs despite internal iliac ligation, preventing damage. So future fertility is not very affected in internal iliac artery ligation, because there is a lot of collateral circulation and anastomotic network which continues to supply blood even to the uterus. Complications, as I said, injury to the ureters, internal iliac vein, accidental ligation of the external iliac artery, and failure to control hemorrhage. There should be control in amount of bleeding, improvement in parameters after ligation. Okay, if bleeding continues unabated, proceed to a hysterectomy, may it be total or subtotal hysterectomy. Okay, so do not wait for too long. Okay, so moving on, arterial embolization. Okay, so in centers where facilities for interventional radiology is available, then this can also be one of the methods in the management of postpartum hemorrhage. So arterial embolization can be therapeutic. In a hemodynamically stable patient, even with atonic PPH, arterial embolization can be used. Or sometimes in a post-hysterectomy patient, if there is any bleeding vessel giving rise to a hematoma or collection in the peritoneum, then arteriography with contrast dye can be used to identify that bleeding vessel and selectively embolize it. This is what is shown in this first picture. Prophylactic balloon catheterization. I've explained this in detail in my lecture on placenta accreta syndrome, that is morbidly adherent placenta. So prophylactic placement of balloon catheters in the internal iliac artery and following delivery of the baby, inflation of these balloon catheters helps in reducing the amount of blood loss after delivery. And also if you decide to proceed to a cesarean hysterectomy, the amount of blood loss is reduced. Okay, so this, in the first picture, you can see this is a pelvic arteriography or a CT arteriography in which contrast is injected. And here from the uterine artery, you can see that there is extravasation of the contrast material. So this shows that this is the bleeding vessel. And now this vessel can be selectively catheterized and embolized instead of reopening the patient. Okay, this is a post-hysterectomy patient with a bleeder. Okay, so this is a radiograph which shows the microcatheter which is placed in the uterine vessel, and it is embolized using cyanoacrylate emboli. So embolization can be done using polyvinyl alcohol particles. It can be done using gelatin sponge, and it can be done, as in this case, cyanoacrylate particles. Okay, so these particles, they polymerize inside the vessel and they block the vessel. Okay, so you need not open the patient again, basically. Okay, coming to obstetric hysterectomy. Okay, very important. It should be performed by a senior obstetrician trained in the procedure. Okay, because it has to be done fast, though it is not to be done unnecessarily too fast, nor unfortunately too slow. So it should be performed by a person who is skilled in performing this procedure. Keep adequate blood and blood products ready, as massive hemorrhage can occur due to extreme vascularity. Subtotal hysterectomy is quick and adequate to control hemorrhage. Okay, so in most of the patients, even a quick subtotal hysterectomy is life-saving. You need not waste any more time in dissecting the bladder, especially if there are a number of adhesions present between the bladder and the lower uterine segment. Okay, total hysterectomy is required in cases of placenta previa or lacerations of the lower segment. In these situations, yes, total hysterectomy will be required. It is sometimes difficult to find the lower edge of the cervix after vaginal delivery, as it is effaced. Okay. In such cases, a hysterotomy can be performed to palpate the lower cervical margin. So make a quick incision on the uterus, place your fingers inside the uterine cavity and palpate for the lower margin of the cervix, so that is where you know that you need to cut your vault. Okay. Sound anatomical knowledge will prevent complications like injury to the ureters. So you have to know what the anatomy is like with the cervix dilated and effaced. Where do the ureters exactly lie in order to prevent injury to them? Next, coming to pelvic packing. Now, this method is seldom used, but it definitely deserves a mention. Pelvic packing is used for significant bleeding, refractory to sutures, as well as topical hemostats. Generally, this pelvic packing is done in a case of post-hysterectomy. If there are a number of oozers or generalized oozing, and you cannot pinpoint a single vessel which you need to ligate to stop this bleeding. Okay. And instead of continuing the procedure, you can just insert a pelvic pack so that it provides the necessary tamponade. And maybe it can be used as a management strategy. It can be used as a temporizing step. Okay, so in this, rolls of gauze are packed to provide constant local pressure. It can serve as a temporizing step prior to interventional embolization, okay, or interventional radiology, which will help you in identifying which vessel is bleeding. If the patient is stable and bleeding appears to have stopped, then packing alone may have helped and can be removed after 24 to 48 hours. Remember, when a pelvic pack is in situ, broad spectrum antibiotics should be given. Okay, now this is a very traditional parachute pack or umbrella pack. It is a plastic pack in which a number of roller gauze are placed end to end. They're tied end to end and placed inside. This pack is placed transabdominally, and the tail of the pack is brought out from the vagina. Okay, maybe you can keep an intraperitoneal drain to measure the amount of ongoing hemorrhage till either definitive management is undertaken, or if you're satisfied that the bleeding has stopped. And in this condition, then you can remove the pelvic pack vaginally itself. Okay. So with that, atonic PPH is done with. Now coming to traumatic PPH. Now we have seen a number of causes of traumatic postpartum hemorrhage. So cervical and vaginal lacerations, uterine inversion, uterine rupture. Okay. Tears, especially cervical tears, are common in cases of precipitate deliveries, instrumental deliveries, manual dilatation of the cervix, which you must not do at any cost, premature bearing down. Do not ask your patient to bear down before complete dilatation of the cervix. It is not going to cause the cervix to dilate any faster than it is going to, but it will just increase the chances of cervical tears. Okay. Previous cervical surgeries also increase the chances of cervical tears. Suspect and exclude cervical tears in cases with bleeding and a contracted uterus. So if you have a tonically contracted uterus, but still there is vaginal bleeding taking place, do not hesitate to perform a widespread and good vaginal and cervical exploration to find out if there are any tears. Okay. Inspection should be done in good light, with good retraction, good assistance, and for cervical inspection and exploration, you need at least 3 sponge holding forceps because they are atraumatic. So cervical inspection, first sponge holding forceps is placed at 12 o'clock position on the anterior lip of the cervix. Second one is placed 45 degrees lateral to the first, and the part of the cervix between these two is inspected. Okay. When you're convinced that there is no bleeding, there is no tear, advance the sponge holding forceps again 45 degrees laterally. Okay. And in this way, entire 360 degrees of the cervix is inspected under good vision and good light. Okay. If you find that there are cervical lacerations, like in this picture, as you can see, there are bleeding lacerations, you need to suture it. Superficial lacerations, which are 0.5 centimeters or maybe 1 centimeter, which are not bleeding, do not need to suture it. They will heal on their own, provided they're not bleeding. But if they are deeper lacerations, more than 1 centimeter with bleeding, then you need to suture them. You cannot just leave it. Okay, suturing material to be used, either 2,0 chromate catgut can be used or polyglactin sutures, that is your Vicryl, can be used. Suturing can be done in continuous interlocking manner or interrupted sutures can be taken. The first suture or the first stitch is to be taken just above the apex of the wound. So if this is the laceration and this is the apex of the tear, first stitch has to be taken slightly above, maybe 0.5 centimeters above the apex. And this is true even for an episiotomy, because there are certain vessels which have been torn and retracted inside. So you need to take care of those vessels as well. Okay. So first suture has to be taken slightly above the apex, and then you continue suturing down till the entire laceration is sutured. Okay. Secondly, if the laceration is very deep and you're not able to reach or you're not able to see well the apex of the cervix, of the cervical tear, then place the suture as high as possible and then apply traction on this suture. Next stitch has to be taken slightly above the first. Again apply traction. Next stitch again goes slightly above the previous stitch until you reach the apex of the tear. Okay, so your last stitch will be slightly above the apex again. Okay, that is how you suture it. But in case the sutures are the lacerations are very deep, very extensive, or you're suspecting a fornicial tear, don't hesitate to take the patient in the operation theater and explore the vagina and the cervix, maybe under anesthesia or a saddle block, under good lighting, good assistance, so that you do not miss out on any tears. Okay. Exploratory laparotomy will be required if extension of these tears have taken place up to the lower uterine segment, or peritoneal perforation is what you're suspecting, or if there is a severe colporexis. So colporexis is when the cervix has been detached or torn away from the vagina, okay, in the region of the fornix. So that is called colporexis. Okay, in such a situation, if you're suspecting that maybe the uterine vessels have been avulsed, or there is any intraperitoneal bleeding or retroperitoneal hematomas, broad ligament hematomas may form, in such a situation, it is always better to perform an exploratory laparotomy. Okay. Okay, coming to the last part of today's lecture, that is secondary postpartum hemorrhage. So first, the definition: it is bleeding from the genital tract after 24 hours of delivery up to 12 weeks postpartum. Okay, this is the RCOG definition. Most important causes are retained bits of placental tissue, retained clots, secondary infection of retained products. So these are the most important causes of secondary postpartum hemorrhage. Others include slipping of loose ligatures with hematoma formation, maybe because of postpartum rise in blood pressure of the patient. Any loose ligatures which may be secure initially may just slip out. Chronic inversion of the uterus, trophoblastic diseases, and pseudoaneurysm or arteriovenous sinus as Caesarean scar site are very rare causes. Okay. Diagnosis is mainly clinical. So you must assess the patient for vital parameters, pulse, blood pressure, temperature. Signs of uterine tenderness again point towards puerperal sepsis. Assess the amount of blood loss, whether it is fresh bleeding, whether you require any blood and blood products for transfusion, what could be the cause of the bleeding. Are there any localized injuries or lacerations or slipped ligatures in the vagina or the cervix? and whether the bleeding is coming from the uterus or from any localized pathology. Foul smelling lochia again is a sign of puerperal sepsis. Ultrasound will help you in guiding diagnosis. It will help you in localizing any retained clots or placental tissue. So as you can see, here we have a transvaginal scan showing a retained placental tissue 6 weeks postpartum. And when you throw in a little Doppler, so we have feeding vessels which can be seen inside this echogenic mass. Okay, so this is suggestive of retained placental tissue. So what is the management of secondary postpartum hemorrhage? In case of retained placental tissue, evacuation or suction curettage is to be done under anesthesia. Remember to give broad spectrum antibiotics, especially in cases of sepsis, should not be omitted. Arrange for blood and blood products as there are chances of severe hemorrhage, especially if that retained placental tissue turns out to be a morbidly adherent placenta. Okay. Gentle curettage should be performed as postpartum uterus is soft and easily perforated. Send the tissue for which is obtained for histopathological examination to rule out trophoblastic disease as well as for culture sensitivity so that you can start organism specific antibiotics. Inspection of the vagina and cervix under anesthesia in good light in order to diagnose any and manage any bleeding lacerations, any hematomas which require to be drained, or any slipped ligatures. Okay. And last part, prevention is always better than cure. How do you prevent in the first place this dreaded complication of postpartum hemorrhage? Most importantly, optimization of hemoglobin and correction of anemia in the antenatal period. So you build up the blood bank which is present in the woman herself. Okay, this is the cheapest form of preventing postpartum hemorrhage. Build in the hemoglobin stores. Blood grouping done at booking visit so that you do not waste any time when such an emergency situation arises. Active management, as we have seen in the last lecture, of the third stage of labor is recommended to minimize blood loss, especially in those at a risk for postpartum hemorrhage. We have seen the risk factors as well. Avoid premature traction on the umbilical cord before placental separation. By doing this, you're just inviting trouble. You're going to end up with an inverted uterus. Okay, so avoid premature traction before placental separation. Check for completeness of placenta on delivery. Make sure that there are no missing cotyledons, there are no missing lobes. Maintain the uterine contraction with uterotonic agents along with frequent monitoring. Prompt suturing of any cervical or vaginal tears. As I said, if required, take the patient to the OT and explore the vagina and cervix under anesthesia if possible and under good lighting. Okay, you have to be confident and sure that there are no cervical or vaginal tears present which could be a cause of postpartum hemorrhage. And strict monitoring of the patient in the fourth stage of labor. If the patient has delivered uneventfully, you have to even then monitor the patient for at least 1 hour, check for her vital parameters, check for urine output, check for bleeding per vaginum, check for tonicity of the uterus for at least an hour postpartum. Okay, so this fourth stage of labor is very important to prevent postpartum hemorrhage, or at least to diagnose bleeding early enough so that intervention can be undertaken. Okay, so with that we come to the end of today's lecture, which was a very important topic in obstetrics, postpartum hemorrhage. And I hope I've been able to cover as much as possible. Thank you very much, all of you. You have been a wonderful audience as usual.